Alright, well, what's happened since my last video? Oh. Well, in order to avoid any potential voodoo, let's talk about a conference that's already dead, or at least has experienced its fair share of conference realignment and survived, albeit in an interesting way. Everyone knows about the Big East's modern iteration and its basketball prowess, as well as its spin-off branch, the American Athletic Conference, but the conference name and history goes a lot further than UConn's national championships. There once was a time where the most exciting football programs out there called the Big East home, even if just for a little while. Images of Miami's most dominant program come to mind, as well as some of the most underrated college teams ever up in Morgantown and Blacksburg. But to examine how the castle crumbled in the Big East, we have to go back to the beginning.
The following is a presentation of the Big East Conference Television Network.
Compared to the other conferences I've made videos on in the past, the Big East is fairly new. Not new in the Big 12 being a spinoff of the Big 8 sense, but new just in general. It was formed by a handful of Northeastern schools in 1979. But there is further background to the Big East than just its beginning, namely with the Metro Conference that could have been. Now, the Metro Conference was not a precursor to the Big East at all. In fact, there was no real connection between the two conferences other than some familiar faces and membership during its inaugural season in 1975. Eventually, it would merge with the Great Midwest Conference in 1995 to create the Conference USA out of its ashes. But the Metro does provide a bit of a blueprint that would be followed years later in the Big East. The Metro itself was founded in 1975 with future Big East members Cincinnati and Louisville, joined by Georgia Tech, Memphis State, which is now just Memphis, Tulane, and the St. Louis Billikens. See why it was called the Metro? It didn't sponsor football, so most of its football-playing members were either members of other conferences or were independents for scheduling. A year later, they were able to add Florida State, but failed to woo South Carolina, who was angling for the ACC bid at the time. When Georgia Tech left the non-football Metro for all-sports ACC in 1979, the Metro replaced them with future Big East member Virginia Tech. St. Louis, consistently overshadowed by the bigger schools, voluntarily stepped down to what would become the Horizon League in 1982 and were replaced by Southern Miss. The scorned South Carolina joined for real this time a year later. A points-shaving scandal in 1985 rendered Tulane athletics suspended, so the conference looked to future Big East member West Virginia, member of the Atlantic 10, as a replacement, though this offer also fell through. Eventually, the conference's leftovers would be picked apart by the Big East and eventually merge into the Conference USA. But it almost didn't end that way. Metro Conference officials considered creating a super conference in 1990 that would have potentially killed the Big East early in its lifespan and probably taken its place as a power conference. This is where the parallels become clear. The proposed super conference would have allowed the league to expand into football, as most of its members were independent for football, and contained a North Division consisting of Boston College, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Rutgers, Syracuse, Temple, Virginia Tech, and West Virginia, and a South Division made up of East Carolina, Florida State, Louisville, Memphis, Miami, South Carolina, Southern Miss, and Tulane. The real kicker of the super conference was Penn State, who was heavily featured in drawn-up plans and likely would have created this conference if they had elected to join. But the Nittany Lions instead chose to focus their attention elsewhere in 1991, dampening the Metro's flames. Following the major conference realignment shifts in 1990, the story of the Metro Conference in relation to the Big East begins to change. But it's easy to see the layout of the Metro in the early 80s and see how it potentially related to the Big East. Both of these conferences shared a handful of schools despite not being affiliated with each other. Let's get back to the Big East. It formed as a scheduling agreement between Georgetown and Washington, D.C., St. John's and Syracuse in New York, and Providence in Rhode Island. According to former Syracuse athletics director Jake Kruthamel, this was due to NCAA scheduling regulations that went into effect at the time, which tended to lock independent schools out from scheduling their rivals who were in conferences. Of these four independent schools, only Syracuse played at a high level of football in 1979. Once they decided to form a distinctly Northeastern Conference, they invited Seton Hall, UConn, and Boston College. Rutgers and Holy Cross declined to join, but Villanova in 1980 and Pittsburgh in 1982 brought membership up to 9. The rapid acquisition of these 9 schools brought immediate attention to the Northeast, particularly as a center for fantastic men's basketball. The 2 Pennsylvania schools were not the only ones with interest, though. In 1982, Penn State, long an independent football power, was also searching for a new home. While the Big Ten was an option even as early as 1980, there was some preference made towards the flashy new league in the Northeast. More interesting still is who was the loudest voice for this move: Penn State head football coach Joe Paterno. According to Bleacher Report's Kevin McGuire, Joe Pa had long pushed for an all-sports conference dedicated to the Northeast football powers, pushing for Maryland, West Virginia, Pitt, Syracuse, Rutgers, BC, and even Temple to create an exclusive league as early as the 70s. Those schools were not receptive, and the Big East was formed instead. Steve Connolly at Onward Slate writes that mutual interest between Penn State and the Big East existed as an impetus to increase the conference's value, seeing as it was seen as primarily a basketball conference. Connolly states that the addition of Pitt was the alternative to Penn State, as the Nittany Lions lost the conference admission vote 5-3. Famously, Big Ten Commissioner and future Big East Commissioner Mike Trangizi told the press after the vote that the Big East would rue the day they let the Lions walk. What happened next? The Nittany Lions stayed in the Atlantic 10 for a handful of years before becoming a pillar of the Big Ten in 1991, likely steeling themselves to be part of the Power 2. The Big East doesn't exist anymore in the form it was in 1982. After its first attempt at adding football to the conference fell through, the Big East sat with its football independent members for nearly a decade before watching other conferences like the SEC and Big Ten formulate larger media deals with football-playing members. 9 teams, only a fraction of which played football, would no longer cut it. The football branch to the conference, separate from the other branches which involved the non-football playing members, was now more than just helpful, it was necessary. It solved this problem by staying largely northeast. In 1991, it plucked independents Rutgers, Virginia Tech, Temple, and West Virginia as football-only members to bring the conference to 13 total members, of which 8 were a part of the football branch. Many of these teams competed outside of football in the Atlantic 10 Conference, but as the Big East, it was pivotal they obtained a flagship institution in one of the most populous parts of the United States, Florida. The Northeast was not primed for growth quite like the South was. Enter, as a full member, the Miami Hurricanes.
They're richly talented and confident. They thrive in prime time, and they've won 44 straight games at the Orange Bowl. They're ranked as college football's #1 team, the Miami Hurricanes.
Miami was far and away from every other member of the conference in 1991, literally and figuratively, with its next closest geographic member being Virginia Tech, nearly 900 miles away. Being on an island did not create much of a distraction for the Hurricanes, though, at least not early. Speaking of expanding to different areas, the Big East was also able to add Notre Dame as a non-football member in 1995. Around that same time, some of the newer additions, like West Virginia and Rutgers, were brought to full membership. Virginia Tech was not brought into full membership until 2000, and Temple remained only a football member until 2004, when it was flat out kicked from the conference for having terrible attendance. It's been said a few times that the Big 12 was the poster child for a shotgun marriage. Time and time again, the conference was hit with realignment woes that became reality, but it persisted. What happened to the Big East next may be what the Pac-12 is now facing, because it did not.
Conference. 10 schools in pursuit of athletic and academic excellence.
As is probably apparent, being essentially 2 conferences in one was not the greatest developmental plan for the conference, with so little turnover between basketball and football members. As of 2003, the conference had 15 members, 8 of which were actually members of the conference for football, and 5 of which did not sponsor Division I FBS football at all. This constantly created tension between the 2 groups, especially within the football-playing groups, who could go to another power conference and instantly achieve more exposure and money in a conference they wouldn't have to share with teams that didn't also play football. In 2004, the pushing and pulling came to a head. The 9-team Atlantic Coast Conference, which shared a coast with the Big East, wanted to establish itself as the premier conference on the East Coast, and thanks to the great athletic performances of some of its teams, was in a better position than the Big East to do so. Getting to 12, like the SEC and Big 12, would enable them to create divisions in a football championship game to create more revenue. They targeted 3 of the better football-playing Big East schools, Boston College, Miami, and Syracuse, and held meetings with the presidents and athletic directors on a potential expansion. At the same time, the other football-playing members of the Big East, Temple, Rutgers, Pittsburgh, West Virginia, and Virginia Tech, grew increasingly concerned about their conference future if those teams left. With the help of Connecticut Attorney General Rick Blumenthal, heads of those schools filed 2 lawsuits in an attempt to prevent potential moves from occurring. One of those lawsuits was aimed at the ACC for potential under-the-table deals to entice teams to leave, and another was specifically aimed at the potential defectors, who were accused of attempting to deliberately undermine the Big East. While the smoke was still burning, Miami and Virginia Tech made the jump to the Big East in 2004. Boston College followed them soon after in 2005. This is where the first rumblings of splitting the conference into an all-sports conference and a non-football conference began. For a brief moment, there was even discussion of merging full-on with Conference USA or a 16-team superconference. These ideas were shot down, mostly due to the NCAA's contracts under the BCS system, relying on the Big East staying as a functional conference in order for its champion to receive an automatic bid for a BCS bowl. Weakened by losing 3 of its most important media markets, Miami, DC, and Boston respectively, the Big East hurried to recover. They did so by adding 3 football members, South Florida, Louisville, and Cincinnati, and 2 non-football members, DePaul and Marquette. UConn also moved its football program to the Big East. Despite these additions, the bleeding didn't stop. In an attempt to create a basketball superconference, the league failed to account for many mouths that needed to be fed based on admittedly smaller football programs, as football made the most money. Despite the bloated effect of their conference proving to dilute money per school further, pushes for more large media markets were made. This was especially seen during the Big 12's struggle with realignment in the early 2010s. The departures of Colorado and Nebraska put the conference on a death spin that saw Missouri and Texas A&M eventually leave, and the rest of the Big 12 South almost create the Pac-16. The Big East saw this and figured that other conferences, namely the ACC, would try to reach 16 teams as well, with them squarely in the crossfire the Big 12 currently was in. Their first option, if you want to believe KU head coach Bill Self, was to further solidify themselves as an all-sports conference by obtaining the Kansas schools, Missouri, and Iowa State, had the Pac-16 come to fruition. These 4 genuine Power 6 schools being added might have given the conference enough monetary firepower to survive past 2013. Alas, the Big 12 remained, so this was no longer feasible. Instead, further expansion into the Group of 5 ranks became the next best option. Of the Group of 5, TCU was identified as the most prominent brand and one that could keep the conference afloat long enough for the Big 12 to fizzle out. Another option that was floated to the conference members was forcing non-football member Villanova to elevate their FCS program to the FBS level, though this never came to fruition. While this was in the works, the Big 12 maneuvered out from under the Big East to invite TCU. Seeing the writing on the wall, West Virginia left the Big East for the Big 12 as well, and Pitt and Syracuse announced their joint departure to the ACC. Rumors of other teams, such as Louisville and Rutgers joining them, became rampant. In panic mode, the Big East now focused on 2 more potential adds, though about as far removed from East as you can get, in Boise State and San Diego State. Famously, their addition was prematurely announced in Times Square. They also went back to the Conference USA well to invite Central Florida, Houston, and SMU. Still scrambling, they attempted to add Navy, Temple, and Memphis, but by then the damage had already been done. Even the few Big East teams that Notre Dame fielded had left. The final nails in the coffin came when Rutgers announced in 2012 that it was leaving for the Big Ten and Louisville to the ACC soon after. Invitations to Tulane and ECU didn't even delay the inevitable. By now, it was clear that the conference had no vision for a dynamic future, and while focusing on football was a good start, it alienated the remaining non-football members to an irrevocable degree. It was time to come off of life support. Following Louisville's announcement in 2013 that they would join the ACC, the Big East dissolved. The so-called Catholic Seven of Georgetown, Providence, St. John's, Seton Hall, Villanova, DePaul, and Marquette decided to split into their own new conference, which later retained the name of the Big East. This caused Boise State and San Diego State to rescind their applications to the football branch. Needing a fresh restart after losing so much, the remaining all-sports teams decided on a name change to the American Athletic Conference. Although it was no longer considered a power conference, the American did retain its commissioner, bowls, and a BCS automatic qualifier bid for as long as the BCS remained through 2014. All in all, the Big East died in 2013. In its place, 2 completely new conferences, the American and a new Big East, were planted. The Big East continued to be a basketball power, adding Xavier and Creighton and eventually re-adding UConn away from the American. The American, meanwhile, struggled to retain its image as a power conference, eventually losing its strongest 3 brands, Houston, Cincinnati, and UCF, to the Big 12. So why is it so pertinent to look at the Big East now, today, in 2023? For starters, a lot of money is generated by schools considered to be Power 5. The teams left behind by conference realignment, like former Southwest and Big East teams, that rejoin Power Leagues always pound how important it is that they are back to receiving money that benefits their athletics programs and their universities. But not all Power Conference teams are the same, and the ship of Theseus can only go so far. The Big East found that out the hard way. It was difficult to keep some of its members when the more monetarily effective members were already leaving. One might be able to plug a Miami-shaped hole with Cincinnati and Louisville duct taped together, but if too many Miamis leave, no amount of G5 backfill can effectively keep the conference afloat, especially with a dwindling payout distributed between even more teams. The Big 12 understood this. Sure, UCF, Cincy, and Houston, all Big East remnants of some sort, couldn't replace Texas and Oklahoma on their own, but it would give them enough of a leg up on the Pac-12, who couldn't fill a USC and UCLA-shaped hole with San Diego State and SMU. Now Colorado is back in the Big 12, and even more could potentially happen in the near future. Even the shining jewel of the current Big East, UConn, fresh off the heels of winning a national championship in that conference, desperately wants out for power conference money and are consistently linked to the Big 12's expansion plans. Pointing fingers and voices going in different directions are another reason to look at the Big East as a cautionary tale. The conference struggled to find a cohesive direction following a few exits. Because of this, infighting accelerated the process of dissolution. The Big 12, perhaps due to West Virginia's membership, understood this, found a cohesive direction, and went with it. Now the Pac-12 is falling apart because they simply couldn't learn from the Big East's mistakes. They failed to adapt or die. Now there's time for the Pac to attempt G5 backfills like the Big East did, but with Oregon and Washington prepped to leave for the Big Ten once the conference gives the word and only a few lifeboats remaining for the Big 12, it's become apparent that they will likely go the same direction. And like Cincinnati in the Big East, it's incredibly likely Oregon State and Washington State suffer a quote-unquote demotion because of their discord in their conference. It's disappointing, it's damaging to cultural ties, it's all a money grab. But unfortunately, as the Big East has shown us, it's the nature of college sports, and it will continue to be as such.